Hey folks, alright, so Descartes left us in a position of profound skepticism about the existence of the external world. Perhaps all that there is the thing that thinks. The I, me, nothing beyond me, no other people, no other minds, no external reality, just a disembodied mind. And we were questioning Descartes' escape from this profound sort of skepticism. If we don't follow him in his proof of God's existence, then we can't follow the path he takes out of radical skepticism. Are there other ways to escape this skeptical problem? This week, we're going to look at a few. We'll start with G.E. Moore, who was an early 20th century philosopher from Cambridge, and he gives us a proof of an external world. We should begin by asking just what a proof is. What is it that Moore promises to give us when he says that he'll give us a proof of the external world? In the simplest sense, a proof is just a demonstration that some conclusion follows from some set of premises. We use proofs in logic and mathematics to show that we ought to accept some conclusion given that we accept some set of premises, that we know with absolute certainty that the conclusion is true if we know that the premises are true. A deductive proof, the kind that we use in logic and mathematics, is said to be valid just in case it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. It's said to be sound just in case it is valid and the premises are all true. So a valid proof need not be a sound proof. A valid proof is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion does follow, but it is not clear that in a valid proof the premises should be accepted. A sound proof, however, must be valid. It's a valid proof where we know the premises are true. To prove some proposition to someone, you have to show them that it follows from premises that they do or must accept. The truth of the conclusion is just as certain as the truth of the premises. Moore says in his proof of an external world that he is responding to a quote from Immanuel Kant. The claim that Kant made is just this: it still remains a scandal to philosophy that the existence of things outside of us must be accepted merely on faith, and that if anyone thinks good to doubt their existence, we are unable to counter his doubts by any satisfactory proof. Kant says we can't give a proof that things outside of us exist, that no one has given a satisfactory proof, and that this is scandalous for philosophy. Moore thinks he can. He thinks he can give many of them, as we shall see. But before we get into Moore's proof, we should ask, what are the things outside of us, the existence of which is called into question? What is Kant talking about when he talks about things outside of us? And how do we end up questioning their existence? Moore says that to say of anything, for example, my body, that it is external to my mind, means merely that from a proposition to the effect that it existed at a specified time, there in no case follows the further proposition that I was having an experience at the time in question. That is, things that are outside of us exist whether or not we are perceiving them, whether or not anyone is actively, presently perceiving them. Their esse is not percipi. Their being is not dependent on their being perceived. So, do these sorts of things exist? Well, before we get to that, let's think about how perception works. Let's think about how it is that we perceive things in the world around us, things that we presume to be external to our bodies, external to our minds. One way that we might think about our encounter with the external world, with objects in that external world, is in terms of what's known as direct or naive realism. According to direct realism, we have an unmediated encounter with objects in our external world. What we see is what's actually there. What we perceive is what is actually the case. But most philosophers, especially those philosophers in the early modern period that we have been encountering, reject direct, naive realism in favor of indirect realism. Recall that we have discussed a number of times now the theory of ideas. The theory of ideas is a kind of indirect realism. What pushes philosophers in the direction of indirect realism is the recognition that the way that we perceive the world to be is not always the way the world is. It seems to us that the sun is rotating around the earth. It rises on one side of the earth and sets on the other. But we know that this isn't the case, that it just seems to us that the sun rotates around the earth because of the way the earth itself rotates. We perceive colors in the world. We look out at objects in the world and see them as having colored surfaces. But we know, on the basis of the science of perception, that colors don't exist in the world. They're a product of the way that different wavelengths of light interact with the rods and cones in our cornea, in our retinas. This means that the image we have of the world, the ideas that we have, are mediating our experience of what is out there. There's the world, the objects in it. They impact upon our sensory apparatus, and we our minds perform various operations on those, on that input, that sensory input, and render it in an image that is what we directly perceive. We are only in direct contact with these mental images, only in direct contact with these ideas. And if that's right, if we're not in direct contact with the objects in the world, but only with these ideas, then we face a new problem. We face the question of whether we can know with certainty that this causal relation holds, whether we can know with certainty that the ideas with which we are in direct contact are in fact good representations of what's actually out there in the world. But how could we ever answer that question? If we can't directly perceive these objects in the world, then how could we ever know that these two match up in the way that we take them to? How could we ever know that the ideas and the objects that the ideas actually map the objects. This is the skeptical challenge. How could we ever know that the ideas that we have in our heads actually represent what's out there in the world? And if we think now about the challenges we saw from Descartes, we see that it is right here that they raise this, or that they raise the skeptical worries. Because Descartes gives us reason to doubt that the direct objects of our perception, these ideas, are in fact mapping anything out here. If there is an evil deceiver, or if it is all a dream, then these ideas don't in fact map an objective reality. Perhaps all we have are the ideas. Perhaps there is no reality external to us. This is a position known as idealism. More, though, thinks that he can give a large number of perfectly rigorous proofs that the external world exists. All he needs to do is identify some kind of object that, if it exists, can exist unperceived, and then give an argument that there are objects of that kind. One is a pretty easy task. He gives the example of seeing a soap bubble. Saying of some object that one perceives that is a soap bubble implies that it is not contradictory to assert also that it existed before one saw it and will continue to exist when one turns away. This is just what distinguishes a real soap bubble from an imagined or hallucinated one. Similarly, when one says, that's a green bottle, or that's a hand, this implies that it existed before I saw it and will continue to exist when I turn away from it. If it didn't imply this, I would be saying of it that it is an imagined or hallucinated hand or green bottle. So, there seem to be objects that can exist unperceived. So if there are soap bubbles, or hands, trees, and green water bottles, then there are external objects. Are there soap bubbles, hands, trees, and green water bottles? Well, here is More's famous proof that in fact there are. Here is one hand. Here is another hand. There are two hands. Therefore, there are external objects. A deceptively simple proof that there are external objects. Here is one hand, here is another hand, therefore there are two hands. There are external objects. Is this a good argument? Well, More gives us three conditions that have to be met in order for an argument to be a good argument. The first condition is that the conclusion must be distinct from the premises. Otherwise, it begs the question. It's a circular argument. The second condition is that the premises must be known to be true. Otherwise, it would fail to be a sound argument, even if it were valid. And the third condition is that the argument has to be a valid argument. The conclusion must, in fact, follow from the premises. So, does Moore's argument meet these conditions? Is the conclusion distinct from the premises? Well, here's the argument again. The premises are labeled 1 and 2. Here is one hand, here is another hand. The premises are the claims from which the conclusion is derived. And the conclusions, labeled C1 and C2, there are two hands, and there are external objects. It sure looks like the conclusions are distinct from the premises. It's at least conceivable that they have different truth conditions. It's not the case that they are making exactly the same claim or have exactly the same content. So it seems that Moore's argument meets the first condition. Are the premises known to be true? Does it meet the second condition? Well, one objection that we might have is that Moore hasn't proved the premises true. And it's impossible to know something if you can't prove it. But is that right? Do you have to be able to prove something in order to know it? Is it possible that we know things that we can't prove? Well, it doesn't strike most of us as a convincing or plausible principle that we have to be able to prove something in order to count as knowing it. I can't prove, for example, that when I look at my hand, I seem to see a hand. It seems to me that there is a hand there. But I certainly can know that I seem to see a hand. Even the skeptic grants this. The seeming, the appearance of a hand, is that with which I am in direct contact. I can't possibly not know it. But I can't prove that it seems to me that there is a hand. So it seems that I can know things that I can't possibly prove. So maybe the premises are known to be true. We'll come back to this question in a moment. Moore's third condition is that the argument has to be valid. Is this argument a valid argument? Here is one hand, here is another hand. There are two hands, therefore there is an external world. An argument is valid if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. The conclusion follows from the premises. C1, the first conclusion, clearly follows from 1 and 2. Here is one hand, here is another. There are two hands. It's not possible that the premises are true and the conclusion false. Does C2 follow from C1? Does it follow that there are external objects from the claim that there are two hands? Is it true that if there are hands, they're the sorts of things that could exist without being perceived? That is, that they are external objects? This is just what the skeptic's been calling into question. So we might wonder whether Moore is in fact begging the question against the skeptic. Consider, for example, Descartes' evil deceiver. My hands would look just the same whether my perception of them was caused by my hands out there in the world or by the evil demon who makes it seem as though they're out there in the world. But when the demon causes it to seem this way to me, my hands only exist in my perception of them. They're not there when I'm not perceiving them. If I am sleeping and not seeing or feeling my hands, they're not there. This suggests an argument. A situation in which I am seeing my hand and a situation in which it seems to me that I am seeing my hand are indistinguishable. If I cannot distinguish between two situations, then I cannot know which of those situations obtains. I cannot know whether I am seeing my hand or merely seem to. Therefore, I cannot know whether I have a hand. This is Descartes' skeptical argument. I can't determine whether I am dreaming or not. I can't determine whether my perceptions are being created or generated by an evil deceiver, or whether they are being caused by objects in the external world. And since I can't distinguish between those two situations, I can't know which of them obtains. I can't know whether I'm actually seeing things in the world or merely seem to see such things. So I can't know whether those things exist. This seems to suggest that More does not, in fact, know the premises of his argument, because the premises are here is a hand, here is another hand, but he can't know that here is a hand and here is another hand if he can't distinguish between the situation where he actually sees a hand and the situation where he merely seems to see a hand. So he can't know whether he's seeing a hand. How does More respond? Well, he says, I certainly did at the moment know that which I expressed by the combination of certain gestures with saying the words, there is one hand and here is another. How absurd it would be to suggest that I did not know it, but only believed it, and that perhaps it was not the case. You might as well suggest that I do not know that I am now standing up and talking. Perhaps, after all, I'm not. And that is not quite certain, and that it's not quite certain that I am. What's going on here? Is he just pounding on the podium, stamping his feet, saying how absurd it would be to suggest that I don't know it? Or is there something more to this claim? Well, I think there's something much deeper in this claim. A better read of More is to see him as insisting that we know with much more certainty and conviction, here is a hand, than we could ever muster for the claim, I cannot know whether I have a hand. The skeptic is asking us to consider this claim, I cannot know whether I have a hand, asking us to accept this claim, I cannot know whether I have a hand. But the falsity of that claim is one of our core commitments. In fact, when I hold up my hand and look at it and say, there is a hand, I can't muster much doubt for that. I'm fairly certain that that claim is true. This means that rather than accept the skeptical argument for More, we should treat the skeptical argument as a reductio ad absurdum, a reduction to absurdity. A valid argument, which the skeptical argument is, leaves us with two options. If we're convinced of the premises, then we have to accept the conclusion. We can't avoid it. But if we are convinced that the conclusion is false, then we have to reject one or more of the premises. Because it's valid, the conclusion follows necessarily from those premises. If we know that the conclusion is false, then we know that one of the premises must be. What More is telling us is that we do in fact know that the conclusion of that skeptical argument is false, because here's a hand is something I can't doubt. And if that's right, then something must be wrong with one or more of the premises. More is a kind of direct realist here. He thinks that perception puts us in unmediated contact with objects out there in the world. and that the skeptic is merely introducing stories or ideas to get us to worry about whether we are in such contact. That's one read of More. But there's an even better way of approaching More's argument. Most of us get frustrated at this point. Look, we want to say, you've pulled off a nice bit of philosophical judo, but you haven't said anything that's going to convince the skeptic. Isn't the point of a philosophical argument to convince your opponent? Since you haven't, doesn't that show that your argument is a failure? Not so fast, I want to say. Why should More have to convince the skeptic? Shouldn't the skeptic have to convince More and the rest of us that the skeptical scenario is plausible and not just possible? Why should More and the rest of us who believe in an external world have to bear the burden of proof? Why shouldn't the skeptic bear that burden? Why shouldn't we force the skeptic to show us that we really ought to doubt? Here is a hand. Not just introduce the possibility of error, but show us that we are, in fact, in error. The skeptic shares this epistemic burden. She doesn't get a free pass. She must justify her doubts, and simply telling me a story about the evil demon doesn't suffice for justification of her doubt that I have hands. My advisor, Michael Williams, who you see on the screen, is a proponent of just this kind of argument. He says that the epistemic practices that we engage in have a sort of default and challenge or default and query structure to them. We grant default entitlement to one another when we make claims, and we challenge the claims of others when we think we need more evidence for them or when we think they might be in error. But challenges to someone's claim themselves require some justification, themselves require some evidence. If someone questions whether you really know something, but doesn't have any good reason for doubting that you do, if they can't muster any justification for their doubt, then you're right to just brush them off. You don't have to take their questions seriously. And the skeptic is doing just this. The skeptic is challenging our claim that here is a hand, or our claim that external objects exist, without giving us any good reason for thinking that in this particular instance we are making a mistake when we say, here is a hand, that we are in error when we say that the green water bottle exists. The sorts of stories the skeptic tells us doesn't raise doubts about this specific instance where I am so sure of what I am seeing. And so the skeptic hasn't met the burden of proof that we should be placing on them. This, I want to say, is the takeaway of More's argument, that the skeptic and the claimant share the epistemic burden. The skeptic can't just raise these worries. So that's our way out of skepticism. That the skeptic is cheating in the game of knowledge. The skeptic isn't bearing the burden of proof that one must bear if one wants to play this game, if one wants to engage in these practices. Next time, we'll take a few minutes to look at another way of trying to address the sort of skeptical worries that Descartes raises in his meditations, a way that comes from Buddhist philosophy and rejects the picture that Descartes gives us that all of our knowledge must rest on singular foundations. So until then, take care.